So, what if I told you? Socrates. He probably would have chuckled at your OnlyFans. Seriously.
Or, that Roman emperors actually preferred guys who were, let's say, modestly equipped.
Exactly. It sounds totally backwards, right?
Yeah.
Especially now when you hear bigger is better all the time.
It really does. It's hard to imagine.
But what if, for the ancient Greeks, having a small package wasn't just okay, it was actually the ultimate badge of honor, like a sign you were virtuous.
That's precisely the paradox we're diving into.
Welcome, everyone, to another deep dive. Today, we are plunging headfirst, maybe slightly nervously, into a topic that's, a bit risque, definitely surprising, and, honestly, maybe even a little liberating. We're talking ancient penis politics.
That's a great way to put it.
We're going to explore how classical antiquity ancient Greece, ancient Rome, viewed male genitalia. And importantly, what their, let's face it, often hilarious views tell us about their core ideas of masculinity, wisdom, and, their wonderfully bawdy sense of humor.
Which they definitely had.
The big puzzle today is how cultures could flip so completely on this. How did we get from their ideal to ours? And what can that massive shift tell us about our own modern anxiety?
Which are pretty significant for a lot of people.
Right. So our mission isn't just like historical trivia. It's maybe to offer you a genuinely fresh perspective, maybe even a comforting one, if you've ever felt that pressure from modern body image stuff.
It really can offer that, I think.
So expect some solid history, a bit of social commentary, and definitely a cheeky sense of humor. Okay, let's unpack this whole thing.
It's genuinely fascinating when you dig into it, isn't it? How completely our cultural values have just inverted over the centuries.
Oddly inverted.
And the really compelling part isn't just that it happened, but the deeper reasons why it happened back then. Because it wasn't just about looks, about aesthetics.
No, not at all.
It ties right into what they valued most in a man. And spoiler alert, it really, really wasn't about size.
Absolutely. And you see it so clearly when you start looking. You immerse yourself in ancient Greek art, the big famous sculptures of gods and heroes, or even just the paintings on vases showing daily life.
Right, the red figure pottery and so on.
Exactly. And what you consistently find is this clear, very deliberate choice. The ideal man is shown with a small, pretty modestly sized penis.
It's unmistakable once you notice it.
And it's not just like the sculptor was shy or something. It's not random. Wow. It's a visual statement they're making about things like virtue, intellect, self-control.
Which is so counter to our modern assumptions, isn't it? We're kind of conditioned to see heroic figures, symbols of power, depicted with everything being, impressive. Big muscles, imposing stance.
Yeah, everything large and in charge.
Yeah.
But the Greeks, they had a totally different playbook. A whole other visual language for showing what superior meant.
Precisely. And it wasn't just implied in the statues and paintings. They actually spelled it out in their writing, in their philosophy.
Oh, really? Like where?
Well, there's fantastic literary evidence. Take the playwright Aristophanes. Yeah. Famous for his comedies, super witty, often pretty biting satire.
Right, the master of old comedy.
Exactly. So in his play The Clouds, which was written around 423 BC, he's basically satirizing what was considered the proper way to bring up a young Athenian gentleman, the ideal citizen.
Okay.
And he lists the desirable traits. You've got things like a gleaming chest and bright skin, broad shoulders and strong buttocks, the physical stuff you might expect for an athletic ideal.
Standard heroic physique, yeah.
But then he has a modest tongue, meaning someone who speaks wisely, doesn't boast, keeps it concise.
Makes sense. Control again.
Right. And then, crucially, he includes, and this is the kicker, a little prick as one of the key positive traits.
Wait, seriously, he just says a little prick?
Yep, right there in the list. It's part of the whole package that made you an honorable, ideal Athenian man.
Wow. Okay, so that wasn't an insult back then.
Not at all. It was a point of pride, almost like a shorthand for being cultivated, respectable, civilized.
So how does that connect to their philosophy? There must be a reason.
There absolutely is. It plugs directly into one of the core Greek philosophical values, self-restraint.
Self-restraint.
Okay, what's that? It's a bit tricky to translate perfectly, but it basically means wise moderation, self-control, temperance, knowing your limits. It's about balance.
Balance. That feels very Greek.
It is. It permeates so much of their thinking, their ethics, how they thought you should live. And so visually, a petite package on a man was a reflection of that self-restraint. It showed he had moderation, restraint, that he could control his animal impulses.
So it was about being civilized, rational, In command of yourself.
Exactly. It's about the mind ruling the body.
That's a crucial distinction. Because the opposite must have been true, too, right? If small was good.
Then large was bad, or at least uncivilized. And yes, that inverse was just as powerful symbolically. To be shown as, well endowed, it was considered ungainly, vulgar, even ridiculous.
Pretty ridiculous.
Oh, yeah. It was explicitly associated with traits they despised. Think lustful barbarians, foolish gluttons. Basically, characters who lacked rational self-control, who were driven purely by their base appetites for food, for sex, for whatever.
So it's a total reversal of how we might think today. Like, hung like a horse would have been an insult.
Pretty much. It would imply you were more animal than man. Imagine the relief that perspective could offer some guys today, constantly bombarded with these impossible standards.
No kidding. Okay, let's nail this down. Maybe we can do our quote this dick segment here. Is there a good quote summing this up?
Huh. Yes, actually. The historian Paul Crystal, who's written a lot about ancient sexuality, puts it very plainly. He says that for the Greeks, a petite package was, quote, a badge of the highest culture and a paragon of civilization.
A badge of the highest culture. Wow. So it wasn't about physical power in that area at all. It was about what your physical moderation represented about your character, your mind.
Precisely. And the artists really ran with this. They used penis size almost like an index of character.
An index of character. I like that.
Yeah, they weren't just drawing anatomically correct figures or trying for realism in that sense. They were literally encoding moral qualities and societal values right into the bodies they depicted.
So, okay, walk me through that. If I see a statue.
Right. So if you see a statue of a hero, maybe Heracles or a god like Apollo or a famous philosopher, and he's got a small, usually flaccid phallus, that's not just anatomical detail, that's the artist signaling.
Yeah.
This guy has calm reason, good character, intellect over impulse.
Okay, got it.
But if you saw a figure with an exaggerated, maybe erect phallus, and we'll get to who those characters were, that was the undeniable visual cue. This guy, ruled by base appetites, animalistic lust, not brains, not virtue.
Like a visual code.
Totally. Which raises a really important question, doesn't it? Why was this specific balance, this visual representation of restraint, so absolutely critical for them? What bigger purpose did it serve in how they saw a man's role in the world?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm wondering. Why this focus? Why was it so central to their idea of the ideal man, or even a functioning society?
Well, it all comes back to that central Greek obsession with balance and restraint, right? That sophrosyne idea we mentioned. It wasn't just about genitals, it was about everything.
Everything.
Yeah. For them, too much of anything, too much food, too much wine, too much emotion, too much boasting was fundamentally distasteful. It showed a lack of virtue, a lack of control.
Okay, I get that with food and drink. How does the anatomy foot in?
Well, think about it. An oversized erection, in their view, fell into exactly the same category as getting sloppy drunk or stuffing yourself at a feast. It wasn't just a physical thing. It signified a lack of self-discipline, a failure of the mind to properly rule the body.
Ah, okay. So an outsized organ suggested that lust, that animal desire, had taken over. That the guy was ruled by his lower instincts, not his higher brain functions.
Exactly. His rational thought was out the window. There's a great quip from one scholar, I love this. He said, the penis was never a badge of virility or manliness in ancient Greece. Potency came from the intellect.
Potency came from the intellect.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. So your real power, your real manliness, came from your brain, not your bulge.
Precisely. And this wasn't just for average Joes. It applied right to the top. The most revered figures in their whole society.
Like who?
Philosophers like Socrates himself, mighty heroes, Heracles again. Even the top gods on Mount Olympus, Zeus, Apollo. When you see them depicted in classical Greek art, they are consistently shown with modest manhoods.
And that wasn't meant to diminish them.
Absolutely not. Quite the opposite. It was visual shorthand to reinforce their key qualities. Their emotional control, their rational moderation, their divine wisdom, their heroic self-mastery. They were telling a story about character through the physical form, and that story prioritized brain over brawn, especially that kind of brawn.
So the message carved into the marble, painted on the vases, it was totally clear, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Real men, ideal men, don't brag about bulk. They show off their brains and their self-control.
Unambiguous.
Just a truly profound idea when you stop and think how completely ingrained the opposite notion is in so much of our culture today.
Yeah,
It really makes you pause.
it really does.
Okay, so we've established that small and tidy was the Greek ideal, sophisticated, intellectual, restrained. So if that was the ideal, you can probably guess what a large, prominent one meant.
Yeah, it wasn't good.
It was the absolute height of absurdity, the ultimate punchline. And this is where it gets really interesting and frankly pretty funny. Exaggerated phalluses weren't just looked down on. They were standard props for anyone foolish, lusty, or just plain uncivilized in Greek culture.
They definitely knew how to use it for comedic effect.
Oh, absolutely. The Greeks knew how to get a laugh, and often they did it below the belt. Quite literally.
Indeed. And to really get this, you just have to look at the Satyrs.
Ah, the Satyrs. The party animals of mythology.
Exactly. These half-man, half-beast dudes, companions of Dionysus, the god of wine, revelry, ecstasy, they were the visual epitome of just letting it all hang out, unrestrained excess.
And how are they shown?
Well, if you look at those red figure vases again, the ones used at drinking parties, the symposia, you'll see satyrs everywhere. And they are almost always depicted with huge, often erect phalluses.
How huge are we talking?
Sometimes ridiculously large, like almost as tall as the satyr himself. They're usually shown chasing nymphs, dancing wildly, maybe passed out drunk, just completely out of control.
So they're basically walking, talking, perpetually aroused visual gags.
Precisely. Their crazy anatomy was a direct symbol of their total lack of restraint, their uncivilized, animalistic behavior. They represented everything the ideal, honorable, controlled Greek man was not.
The polar opposite.
Totally. There's one historian who puts it quite bluntly. Big penises were vulgar and outside the cultural norm, something sported by the barbarians of the world.
Wow, vulgar and barbaric.
Yep. Their outsized anatomy visually represented their outsized appetites for wine, for women, for any kind of indulgence, completely uncontrolled. The visual joke was crystal clear. Look how ridiculous and animalistic a big erection makes you. It was powerful social commentary, even if it was crude.
And this wasn't just in mythology, right? Didn't it spill onto the stage?
Oh, absolutely. Greek theater, especially that raucous old comedy, think Aristophanes, again took this body gag and just ran with it, literally on the stage.
How do they do that?
Well, the actors would wear these completely absurd, often grotesque costumes. Frequently, they'd have padded fat suits, exaggerated masks making them look ridiculous, and most noticeably, enormous leather phalluses just dangling there.
Fake leather ones.
Yep, strapped on. And these weren't subtle little things. They were designed to be huge, to bounce around, swing wildly for maximum comic effect. The audience would just erupt.
Like ancient slapstick, but with anatomy.
Exactly. It was their brilliant, if unsubtle, way of caricaturing characters as total buffoons.
Who are these characters usually?
Could be anyone they wanted to mock. A foolish old man trying to act young, a corrupt politician full of hot air, a boastful soldier who was actually a coward, or just a horny idiot driven by lust. The giant fake junk was there to underscore their lack of control, their stupidity, how they were slaves to their urges.
So the audience laughing wasn't just because it looked silly.
No, there was a deeper social message. They roared with laughter, partly because it was crude and funny, sure, but also because it reinforced that core value. Anyone driven mainly by lust, anyone lacking self-restraint and moderation, soft-restraint again, was a figure of ridicule, someone to be laughed at, not admired.
There's a scholar, Shelby Brown, who made a great point about this, right?
Yes, she noted that dressing actors up with these exaggerated bellies and massive phallies was an excellent way to ridicule elite norms. It was social critique disguised as farce.
So making fun of the powerful or hypocritical?
Exactly. By highlighting their supposed flaws through this exaggerated anatomy, it reinforced, by contrast, what a truly respectable man was supposed to look like and act like. Trim, controlled, and yes, modestly hung. It was comedy with a very clear moral lesson embedded in the absurdity.
And this phallic stuff wasn't just on stage, it was in rituals too.
Deeply embedded. Think about the big Dionysian festivals. These were huge annual celebrations for Dionysus, god of wine, theater, ecstasy.
Like major public holidays.
And they often involved these wild, merry, sometimes chaotic parades through the streets. And what was often featured prominently, enormous phallus sculptures.
Sculptures, like floats.
Yeah, sometimes several stories high, carried through the streets, accompanied by people singing these bawdy, often obscene songs. In fact, Aristotle himself, the great philosopher, observed that Greek comedy literally originated from these ancient phallic songs.
No way. So comedy literally grew out of singing dirty songs while carrying giant phalluses.
Pretty much. It's like imagining Mardi Gras mixed with a fertility ritual and maybe an open mic night. Our hung in history moment here could be picturing a conga line with a giant penis float at the front. That's basically the birthplace of Greek comedy.
That is absolutely wild. It puts a whole new spin on going to the theater.
Doesn't it? And it wasn't just for crude laughs either. These public phallic displays were believed to have a deeper, almost magical function.
Magical how?
The Greeks believed that intense laughter, especially laughter directed at something explicitly naughty or absurd, like a giant phallus, could actually ward off evil spirits and bad luck. It was a form of what's called apotropaic magic, using something shocking or funny to avert harm.
So laughing at a big penis kept the demons away.
Essentially, yes. It was a cathartic release for the community, a way to appease the gods, maybe ensure fertility for the crops and people, and protect everyone from misfortune. So that giant parade phallus wasn't just a prop for a joke. It was seen as a societal valve, a source of communal joy, and a potent symbol of protection and abundance.
Okay, so let's tie this act together. In Greek art, literature, theater, rituals, a big penis consistently meant buffoonery, chaos, lack of virtue. It was the visual sign of stupidity, right?
Right. Being more of a beast than a man, as Paul Crystal put it so well.
And they even used this against their enemies.
They did. On some ancient Greek vases, you'll see battle scenes or interactions with foreigners like Egyptians or Persians, and the enemies are sometimes depicted with absurdly large genitals.
Like a visual insult.
Exactly. A visual smear campaign. It was a quick way to imply they were uncivilized, barbaric, lacking rational control, everything the Greeks prided themselves on not being.
So the message was totally consistent. If you were driven by your lower urges, if you lacked that sophophosizing, you were basically a joke, a figure of scorn, not admiration.
Unambiguous. And that final punchline from Paul Crystal really sums it up. When a man's that hung, he's probably a half donkey.
A half donkey. Perfect. It was comedy with a moral. The wise man keeps it in proportion, while the big schlonged fool is ruled by his lower instincts. Okay, mind blown already.
And we haven't even gotten to Rome yet.
Right, let's take that trip west, from the marble groves of Greece to the empire-building roads of Rome. Now, you might be wondering, did the Romans just copy the Greeks on this? They copied so much else. Did they also praise the small and laugh at the large?
Well, yes and no, or rather, yes, but with their own very Roman spin. They definitely inherited that basic Greek framework. Serious, elite figures, small, comedic, vulgar, magical figures, large.
Okay.
But then, in typical Roman fashion, they kind of took the silly, symbolic side and just amplified it. They went absolutely wild with the phallus as a symbol, especially for luck and humor.
So they kept the serious ideal, but doubled down on the jokes and magic.
Pretty much. On the serious side, you still see it clearly. Educated Romans hugely admired Greek art and philosophy, so that classical ideal of the sculpted male body with modest genitals absolutely persisted.
So emperors and heroes still look that way in statues.
Definitely. Go to any museum with Roman statues, you'll see emperors depicted heroically nude, or copies of famous Greek athletes and gods. And almost without fail, they followed the Greek model. Toned bodies, noble faces, and quite compact, discreet genitalia.
Professor Mary Beard had a quote about this, didn't she?
She did. She summed it up perfectly. When you look at the perfect body in elite sculpture, the one thing that's not stressed is the penis. It's either small or very often conveniently covered by a bit of drapery.
Which again, for us today, living in a culture that often links male power and size, that's just such a radical difference in visual emphasis, isn't it?
It truly is. And that under-endowment in the serious Roman statues, it was just as deliberate a statement as it was for the Greeks. It connected to their own ideals.
Like what? Did they have sophrosyne too?
They had similar ideas, often framed around virtus and gravitas. They certainly embraced the concept of mens sana and corpore sano, a healthy mind and a healthy body. And for them, just like the Greeks, a large organ suggested an oversexed mind, a mind not fully in control, easily distracted by carnal desire.
So small penis meant bigger brain, basically.
That was the implication, yes. Historians point out that for educated Romans, smaller penises meant larger intellects. The underlying thought was that only an animalistic brute, someone lacking true Roman virtus, that mix of manliness, courage, duty, excellence, would be primarily driven by base urges.
Whereas the ideal Roman.
The ideal Roman, the philosopher, the statesman, the good emperor, prioritized his brain, his duty, his gravitas, that sense of dignity, seriousness, responsibility. A big penis suggested you were maybe a bit frivolous, or worse, brutish. A small one implied you were a refined citizen, intellectually robust, morally sound.
And did they write about this too? Like the Greeks did?
Oh, yes. You see it in Roman literature. Think of poets like Juvenal. He wrote these scathing satires that often mocked male lust and sexual excess, viewing it as a sign of moral decline in Rome.
So he wasn't impressed by studs.
Not at all. And then there's the poet Martial, famous for his short, witty, often quite rude poems called epigrams. He definitely joked about well-endowed men, but always as objects of humor or even disgust, never admiration.
Any examples?
There's one famous epigram where he makes fun of a guy with both a really long nose and a really long penis. Marshall quips that the guy can basically smell his own penis every time it gets hard.
Oh my God.
Yeah. Equating the big nose and the big tool as equally laughable, maybe even grotesque physical flaws. So the classical punchline held true across cultures. In Latin or Greek, a big dong meant you were probably a ding-dong.
Okay, so the serious side matches Greece.
Yeah.
But you said the Romans went wild with the other side, the lighthearted stuff.
They absolutely did. This is where Roman phallic culture really takes off in its own unique direction, blending humor, superstition, and everyday life. They didn't just use the phallus for jokes, they turned it into a pervasive good luck charm, a protective symbol you saw everywhere.
The fascinum, is that what it's called?
Exactly. The fascinum, the divine phallus symbol. It was widely believed to ward off the evil eye Invidia, which they really feared, and to bring good fortune and prosperity.
And you actually find these things.
Everywhere. Especially in places preserved like Pompeii. Archaeologists have unearthed countless examples. Little phallic amulets, often made of bronze or bone, worn around the neck, especially by children for protection.
Like a St. Christopher medal, but
Yeah.
different.
Sort of, yeah. You find elaborate phallic carvings on the walls of houses and shops, frescoes in private homes featuring phalluses, and even practical uses like paving stones in Pompeii carved with a phallus pointing the way.
Pointing where?
Well, sometimes it might just mean good fortune this way, or maybe point towards a specific shop. But yes, sometimes they quite clearly pointed the way to the city's brothels. Practical and cheeky.
Okay, that's pretty bold. What else?
Then you have the tintinnabula. These are fantastic.
Tintinnabula. Sounds like bells.
They are. They were incredibly popular household items, basically bronze wind chimes. But the central figure was often a phallus, sometimes with wings, sometimes part of a whole it's a phallic figure, a figure with an erect penis, and it would have little bells hanging off it.
So wind chimes, shaped like flying penises with bells.
Pretty much. And they weren't just decorative. The Romans believed that when the wind blew, the combination of the tinkling bells and the jaunty, often comically huge phallus, work together to scare off evil spirits and bring good luck and prosperity to the home or shop they were hung in.
That's amazing. Our Hung in History segment is definitely featuring the tintinnabulum. Picture that. A charm hanging by your door, a winged penis with bells chiming away. It seems totally absurd to us now, maybe like a gag gift.
Right. But for the Romans, it was both genuinely funny and seriously protective. A perfect blend of the sacred, the profane, and the everyday. Such a different way of seeing that imagery.
Okay, that's wild. Is there anything even more extreme?
Oh, you bet. Perhaps the most extraordinary example of Rome's unique take on phallic symbols is the cult of Priapus.
Priapus, I've heard that name. Doesn't it relate to a medical condition?
It does. Priapus was originally a minor Greek fertility god associated with gardens, livestock, bees, that sort of thing. But the Romans adopted him and really amplified his main feature. They turned him into this widely recognized, often comical, guardian deity of gardens, orchards, and general wealth and abundance.
And his main feature was?
His invariably massive, permanently erect phallus. It's the defining characteristic. So much so that the medical term for a persistent, often painful erection, priapism, comes directly from his name.
Wow, that's quite a legacy for a minor god. So they put statues of this guy around.
Yes, all over the place. Statues of Priapus, often depicted as these somewhat crude, sometimes gnome-like figures, but always with these vastly oversized erect genitals, were strategically placed in gardens, vineyards, and doorways.
Why there?
Multiple reasons. Partly as a symbol of agricultural fertility, hoping he'd make the plants grow, partly as a scarecrow, literally, to scare birds, but also human thieves, and partly, again, as that apotropic charm against bad luck and the evil eye.
How would he scare thieves? Just by looking ridiculous.
Yeah. Partly that, but also through implied threat. The idea was that any intruder, or even just someone casting an envious glance, would be frightened, or at least hilariously deterred, by the god's enormous weapon. Many of these Priapus statues actually had threatening inscriptions carved on them,
Threatening how?
often quite explicitly sexual and violent. One famous example, a graffito poem attributed to Priapus himself, basically warns any would-be thief. If you steal my vegetables, I will find you, and I will sodomize you with this big red pole of mine.
Oh my goodness, that is basically the ancient Roman beware of dog sign, but with an incredibly obscene and frankly hilarious twist. Talk about home security.
Absolutely, don't mess with Priapus's garden, and one of the most famous depictions is in Pompeii, in the lavish house of the Veti.
What's there?
Right near the entrance, there's this amazing fresco. It shows Priapus standing next to a scale. In one pan of the scale is a big bag, presumably full of gold coins representing the family's wealth. In the other pan, Priapus is weighing his own immense phallus.
You're kidding.
Nope. And guess what? His phallus weighs more than the bag of gold.
That's incredible. What did that even mean?
It was definitely a very tongue-in-cheek boast by the homeowner. It's saying, we're rich and we're virile, connecting wealth and potency. But it also had that crucial apotropaic function again. The sheer absurdity and shocking nature of a god literally balancing his junk against his bank account was thought to deflect envy, that dangerous evil eye.
It's almost like Priapus walked so Magic Mike could strut. In a weird way. A totally different performance, but still playing with displays of masculine power, framed with humor and maybe a touch of absurdity.
That's a fun comparison. And yeah, the Roman approach was often much more about this blend of overt display, humor, and superstition than the Greek focused purely on intellectual restraint versus base impulse.
And this wasn't just for gods or rich people, right? Did regular Romans get in on the phallic humor?
Definitely. Roman graffiti and everyday jokes, especially from places like Pompeii and Herculaneum, showed that the big phallus largely stayed in the realm of comedy, insult, or magic. It wasn't something a serious, respectable man would be admired for.
So what kind of graffiti are we talking about?
Lots of crude drawings of penises, often with snarky captions. Think of them as ancient bathroom stall scribbles or maybe even early internet memes. They were everywhere.
Any specific examples?
Well, there's a Roman graffito found relatively recently in Britain at Vindolanda near Hadrian's Wall. It shows a clear drawing of a phallus, and next to it, the name Secundinus and the word caca, which basically means shitter.
So like an ancient insult meme, a drawing of a dick next to Secundinus is a jerk.
Pretty much. Carving a phallus and a profanity seems to have been the Roman equivalent of firing off an offensive tweet just scratched onto a wall. A quick, crude way to express disdain and maybe get a laugh.
Any others?
There's another famous one from Pompeii, a scrawled message that reads something like, "Weep, you girls, my penis has given you up. Now it penetrates men's behinds. Goodbye, wondrous femininity."
Wow, okay. That's something.
Yeah, it's a pretty crude taunt, right? Boasting about sexual prowess, maybe sexual flexibility, framed as a kind of humorous insult to women. But again, notice it's humor, it's a boast, it's maybe shocking, but it's not presenting this as the ideal of Roman masculine virtue.
So the key takeaway for both Greece and Rome is...
The key point is that while neither culture was shy about depicting penises, big ones were almost always framed as comedic or grotesque or supernatural and protective, not as the aspirational ideal for a refined, respected man. Just like the Greeks, a respectable Roman man might be praised in literature or inscriptions for his virtus, his courage and manliness, or his gravitas, his dignity and seriousness.
But never for his endowment size.
Exactly. Meanwhile, the popular culture, the satire, the folk beliefs absolutely reveled in this over-the-top phallic absurdity for laughs, for luck, and for insults.
Okay. My mind is officially reeling from ancient penis politics. So let's try to unpack this now. After digging through all that fascinating, often, frankly, bizarre historical context, you can't help but laugh, right?
Definitely.
And then you reflect on just how dramatically things have flipped in our modern world. Today, in so many cultures, particularly Western ones, it feels like the default assumption is reversed. A larger penis is often seen as the ideal, prized as a sign of masculinity, sexual prowess, maybe even social status.
It's almost the exact inverse of that classical ideal we've just spent all this time exploring.
Totally. Think about common slang. Hung like a horse. That's usually meant as a compliment today, right? Maybe a boast or at least an aspiration for some.
Absolutely.
Whereas, as we've learned, to an ancient Athenian, that might have implied you were more beast than man, closer to one of those wild satyrs than a respected philosopher-citizen.
It's a complete nod-degree turn, and this modern obsession, this fixation on size, it's closer to really pervasive anxiety among many men.
You see that in studies, right?
Consistently. Research shows penis size ranks incredibly high among body image concerns for men. One big survey found something like 2 out of every 3 men expressed some level of dissatisfaction with their size.
2 out of 3, that's huge.
It is, especially when you consider that the vast majority of men fall well within the statistically normal range for penis size, yet the anxiety persists.
There's even a clinical term for it, isn't there? Something like small penis syndrome.
That's right. It describes men who have a medically average-sized penis, but are absolutely convinced they're undersized, and they experience significant psychological distress because of this belief. It's a really stark example of how powerful cultural messaging can be. It can literally reshape how you perceive your own body and your self-worth.
So this really begs the million-dollar question, doesn't it? How on earth did we get here? How did we go from celebrating the petite in ancient Athens to collectively fretting about bigness today? Maybe this is time for our Shrink the Myth segment.
Good idea. Well, historians point to a few key shifts over the centuries. First, during late antiquity, and then especially through the medieval Christian era in Europe, there was a major cultural shift. Open discussion and depiction of genitals, even in art, became much more taboo.
So modesty became the rule.
Largely, yes. In public life and representation, the whole issue of size kind of went underground. It was less publicly discussed, less visually referenced than it had been in Rome.
Okay, so it fades from view for a while. Then what happens?
Well, fast forward quite a bit. The big game changer seems to be the modern era, particularly the 20th and 21st centuries, with the rise of science looking at sexuality, but even more impactfully, the explosion of mass media, and specifically pornography.
Ah, porn. That comes up a lot in discussions about body image.
For good reason. The rise of widely accessible pornography and just increasingly sexualized media in general seems to have profoundly amplified this bigger is better idea, especially in a sexual context.
How so?
Well, think about it. Pornographic films, for obvious commercial reasons, tend to feature performers who often have significantly above average endowment.
Right, it's part of the fantasy element.
Exactly. But when that becomes the main visual reference point for sexuality for a lot of people, it inevitably skews perceptions of what's normal or desirable. It creates this completely unrealistic benchmark.
It sets up a distorted reality for viewers, doesn't it? Like a kind of visual inflation that messes with people's heads.
Absolutely. And studies back this up. For instance, a 2019 study highlighted that increased exposure to sexually explicit material directly correlates with lower genital self-esteem, particularly in men.
So watching porn makes average guys feel inadequate.
That seems to be a common outcome, yes. Seeing those often atypical bodies presented as the norm can lead to anxiety, body dissatisfaction, even body dysmorphic disorder in some cases. And the result?
The male enhancement industry.
Exactly. Yeah. A massive global industry selling pills, pumps, lotions, even risky surgeries, all thriving on these modern insecurities about not measuring up. Rates of cosmetic penis enlargement procedures have climbed significantly in recent decades, despite many doctors warning about the potential risks and often limited, dubious benefits.
So it's clear that the ancient Greek slogan of small is sophisticated hasn't just been forgotten.
It's been completely flipped, commercialized, and arguably turned into something quite damaging for a lot of people.
Yet, maybe thinking about that ancient perspective isn't just historically interesting. Maybe it offers something more.
Yeah.
Could you argue that our modern fixation on size is actually kind of foolish?
You could definitely argue that. In a way, maybe we're the butt of an old joke that we don't even recognize anymore.
How so?
Well, the Greeks and Romans, as we saw, fundamentally understood that equating penis size directly with power or virility or virtue was a crude, even laughable mistake. They built this whole visual and literary language to mock that idea, to caution against letting the phallus rule your identity or dictate your self-worth.
So they saw the absurdity in it.
They did. Now, obviously, modern society doesn't share their exact aesthetic tastes. You don't see Marvel sculpting Captain America with a conspicuously small bulge today.
No, definitely not.
But the underlying message from antiquity about moderation, about valuing character and intellect, about not being driven solely by base instincts or physical attributes, maybe that message is actually more relevant than ever in our image-obsessed world.
That's a really comforting thought, isn't it? Or at least kind of hilariously perspective shifting.
It can be. In an era where, sadly, some young men might develop genuine anxiety or depression over not looking like a porn star, remembering the ancient Greek or Roman perspective can be weirdly therapeutic.
Like imagine telling that insecure guy at the gym,
"Hey, cheer up. In ancient Athens, you would have been the absolute pinnacle of manly beauty." That sounds completely facetious, right?
Oh, totally.
But it's genuinely rooted in historical fact. And just knowing that can help liberate us a bit from these culturally imposed, often unrealistic and constantly shifting ideals about bodies.
And the humor aspect hasn't gone away either, has it? Satire and comedy still grapple with male body image all the time.
Oh, absolutely. Just think about it. Phallic jokes are still a total staple in stand-up comedy routines, in movies, especially comedies, and all over the internet in memes.
Right, like the eggplant emoji is basically becoming the universal stand-in for a phallus in texts.
Exactly. Or think about viral concepts like big dick energy, which interestingly wasn't even necessarily about literal size, but about a certain kind of confidence, still playing in that same symbolic arena.
So we're still laughing at extremes, just like the ancients did.
In many ways, yes. Even if the context has changed and maybe the specific direction of the ideal has flipped, the use of the phallus, especially the exaggerated one as a comedic prop, persists.
Like internet humor with absurdly oversized things.
Yeah, that's not actually that far removed conceptually from a Roman painting a giant phallus on a wall and writing an insult next to it. It's playing with proportion for shock value and laughs. Now, we might not parade 25-foot phallus floats through the streets anymore to ensure a good harvest.
Probably for the best, maybe. At least not in most places.
Probably. But phallic humor itself, still very much alive and kicking. It proves that some things, like finding the human body and its functions both fascinating and funny, are truly timeless.
But there's a key difference now, isn't there? On the flip side, our society seems to have very few positive representations of the small penis.
That's a crucial point. Instead of praising modesty or linking small size with intellect like the Greeks did, our culture often treats it as a punchline in a joke, or worse, a source of genuine shame or inadequacy. That's the complete inverse of those ancient values.
Which really brings us back to the question, okay, we know it flipped. What can we actually learn from this dramatic historical reversal today?
Well, I think this is where stepping back and getting that historical perspective is incredibly healthy, maybe even wise. It shows us, beyond any doubt, that body ideals are not fixed. They are culturally constructed. They change drastically over time and across cultures.
What one era mocks, another might worship.
Exactly. The Greeks idealized the modest, average endowment as a sign of sophistication. Today, many men feel immense pressure to live up to an unrealistic, often porn-fueled ideal of largeness. Just knowing that history, knowing that figures like Socrates or Emperor Augustus would likely have preferred a petite package, can be a genuine eye-opener.
It demonstrates that big doesn't automatically equal better, right? It's all about the cultural lens.
Precisely. It's all in the eye of the beholder, or maybe more accurately, it's shaped by the deeply ingrained cultural values of the society you happen to live in. And those values can and do change.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, what does this wild journey into ancient penis politics mean for you, listening right now? Well, hopefully this deep dive has given you a rich, maybe amusing, and definitely insightful look at how ideas about masculine identity have been shaped by art, philosophy, and just everyday culture for thousands of years.
We saw how ancient Greece and Rome both used the penis as this really powerful, unambiguous symbol. A little one signified the high-minded, intellectual, controlled man,
while a big one was reserved for the clown, the barbarian, the beast, or the figure of fun and magic.
Right. Through their statues, their vase paintings, their hilarious satirical plays, even their everyday good luck charms like those wind chimes, they consistently reinforce this idea that true virility, true desirable masculinity lay in self-control, in intellect, not just in anatomy or ego.
Their world was filled with these literal phallic symbols, from the marble gods with their modest proportions to those terracotta Priapus figures with their comical exaggerations. And these visuals were constantly prompting men and society to consider, what kind of man are you? How do you truly measure up?
And importantly, that ancient question wasn't really about physical inches. It was fundamentally about moral character, about being a rational, disciplined, contributing member of society, not just a creature of impulse.
So if we connect all that ancient history back to our own time, maybe we find ourselves in a society that's kind of hung like a hypocrite.
That's one way to put it.
You know, we profess enlightenment, sophistication, body positivity.
Right.
Yet many people are still oddly fixated on this almost primitive-sized contest that the ancients themselves would probably find hilarious, maybe even pitiable.
Perhaps by blending that historical insight with a healthy dose of humor like the Greeks and Romans did, we can start to demystify some of this modern obsession, maybe lighten our own collective load of anxieties around it.
Exactly. After all, if we can laugh along with Aristophanes and Juvenal at the idea of the dude with the ludicrously big dong being the idiot of the story, maybe we can realize that a lot of our modern angst over size is, in the grand historical scheme of things, scholarly speaking, laughably overblown.
It certainly puts it in perspective.
And it makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other modern fixations are we holding on to so tightly right now that a little trip back into history might help us lighten up about? Or maybe even find some genuine liberation from? Something to think about.
Definitely food for thought.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this uniquely revealing deep dive. We sincerely hope it's given you a fresh, maybe even a slightly comforting perspective on some very old and yet very current human anxieties.
And we really encourage you, next time you're in a museum or looking at pictures of classical art, take a closer look. Go explore that classical art and literature with these ideas in mind. You might just find a whole new layer of meaning and definitely some humor in the most unexpected places, right there in the ancient world.
Absolutely. Until next time, keep digging, keep learning, and keep asking those wonderfully curious questions.